Reverend Jameson never imagined his church would become the stage for a murderer's chilling confession, and Detective Marla Simmons soon discovered that the midnight truth spoken within those walls would unravel a web of crimes darker and more twisted than the town had ever feared. Reverend Jameson had always believed the church was a place where people came seeking peace, forgiveness, or comfort. On most nights, the sanctuary stood silent, its rows of wooden pews lined neatly beneath the glow of stained glass windows. That Thursday evening had been no different. He moved slowly down the aisle, checking hymnals and straightening cushions, while the sound of the storm outside rattled against the ancient walls. Lightning flashed, throwing patterns of color across the altar, and thunder rolled deep in the distance. To him, it felt like any other stormy night, until the doors creaked open at exactly midnight. A man stepped inside, dripping wet, his face pale beneath the flickering candlelight. His entrance was neither loud nor hurried, but it carried a weight that made the air inside the church shift. Reverend Jameson froze, realizing instantly this was not an ordinary visitor. The man walked unsteadily toward the front, his boots leaving wet prints on the stone floor. His hands trembled as he clutched his coat tighter around him, as though trying to hold himself together. He did not glance at the pastor or at the glowing cross on the wall. Instead, he moved straight toward the center of the sanctuary and sank to his knees. His breathing came in ragged bursts, as if he had run a great distance or was carrying something too heavy for his conscience to bear. Then he began to speak. His voice was low at first, shaking with every word, but soon the sound filled the empty space as though the walls themselves were listening. What came out was not a prayer. It was a confession. He described a night months earlier, one the town had long tried to forget. A young man had disappeared after leaving a local diner late in the evening. The police had searched. Volunteers had combed through the woods, and flyers with his face had been posted across every store and lamppost. But no answers came, and eventually whispers turned into silence. Families moved on, though none without unease. Now, in the quiet heart of St. Mark's Church, the missing pieces fell into place. The stranger gave details only the killer could have known: the exact time of the abduction, the alley where the first blow was struck, the abandoned warehouse where the body was left behind. He spoke of every movement, every sound, and even the smell of the place. It was not a vague confession driven by guilt. It was precise, methodical, chilling. Reverend Jameson's heart pounded as he listened, realizing this man was peeling back the veil on a truth no one had been ready to face. Rain battered the windows harder as the confession grew darker. The man's eyes were hollow, reflecting the dim light of the candles, and his words came without hesitation, as though he had rehearsed them countless times in his head. By the time he reached the end, silence consumed the room. The storm outside seemed to pause for a moment, leaving only the sound of water dripping from his coat onto the floor. Reverend Jameson could not move. He felt trapped between duty to his faith and the terrifying weight of what he had just heard. The church, which had always been his refuge, now felt like the stage of something unholy. He knew nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the echoes of the midnight confession lingered inside Reverend Jameson's mind. He had barely slept, replaying every word, every haunting detail spoken within the church. As sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, the sanctuary looked unchanged, yet it carried a new weight, as though the shadows themselves remembered the night before. By mid-morning, the quiet town stirred with shocking news. A body had been discovered in an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town, just as the man had described. Police had cordoned off the building. Reporters gathered like vultures, and whispers spread faster than the rising smoke from chimneys. For Reverend Jameson, the truth of the confession could no longer be questioned. The stranger Essie words were not just a tortured man, SS imagination. They were the roadmap to a hidden crime. Detective Marla Simmons arrived at the scene with her usual composure, but even she was unsettled by the accuracy of the discovery. The body belonged to Daniel Pierce, the young man who had vanished half a year earlier, his smiling face remembered only from weathered missing posters. Simmons had chased his case for months with no leads, only to have it unravel in the most unexpected way, a midnight confession inside a church. It was as though the killer had chosen the sanctuary as both stage and witness, exposing his crime in a way that demanded recognition. But why there? And why now? Those were questions she couldn't shake. As the news spread, the church quickly became more than a place of worship. People gathered outside, pointing toward its doors as though the building itself had betrayed them. Some came seeking answers, others came out of morbid curiosity. Reverend Jameson watched the crowds with unease, knowing they could never understand what it felt like to stand in that moment and hear the truth pour from a stranger's lips. The weight of knowledge pressed down on him, sharper than any sermon he had ever given. He wrestled silently with guilt. He had heard the confession before the body was discovered, and yet he had done nothing until the evidence surfaced. Meanwhile, Detective Simmons began connecting the dots. She pored over old files, mapping Daniel's last known movements, revisiting witness accounts, and lining them up with the details of the confession. Everything matched. The time Daniel had left the diner, the alleyway where he had disappeared, the path to the warehouse where he had been hidden. What unsettled her most was the precision of the confession. The killer had not rambled in guilt or slipped accidentally. Instead, it sounded rehearsed, deliberate, almost as if he wanted to be caught. Still, he had not gone to the police or called an emergency line. He had gone to a church, to a pastor. That choice gnawed at her, hinting at layers of motive that went beyond a simple need for forgiveness. By nightfall, the church doors were locked, but the whispers outside grew louder. St. Mark's had become a symbol of darkness revealed, its holy walls now linked with the unholy truth of a hidden murder. For Reverend Jameson, the sanctuary no longer felt like a place of peace. It was now a crossroads where faith, guilt, and justice collided, and he knew the confession had only opened the first door into something far more complex than anyone was prepared to face. Detective Simmons had always trusted her instincts, and this case was no different. The confession had solved one mystery, but the manner in which it was delivered left her uneasy. She began retracing the man's life, digging through employment records, bank statements, and police reports that had been buried under dust. The surface painted him as ordinary, a mechanic at a local garage living in a small apartment paying bills on time. Yet beneath the dull routine were shadows. Former neighbors spoke of strange noises late at night, visitors who never returned, and the way he watched people as though studying them. Simmons pieced together fragments of his life until a disturbing pattern emerged. Daniel Pierce, the first confirmed victim, was not alone. A search warrant for the man's apartment revealed the first undeniable clue. Behind a false wall in a closet, detectives found boxes filled with old photographs and personal belongings. Some were harmless, birthday cards, receipts, and worn journals. But others were chilling. A driver's license belonging to a missing woman. A broken watch reported in another unsolved disappearance. Photographs of people taken without their knowledge, each image dated and carefully filed. It was not the chaos of a careless criminal, but the order of someone who documented everything. Detective Simmons felt her stomach twist as she flipped through the evidence, realizing she was holding the archive of a predator who had lived undetected for years. While the investigation expanded, Reverend Jameson's torment grew heavier. He walked through the pews at night, hearing echoes of the man's confession in the stillness. Guilt consumed him, not because he had failed to act, he had told the police the truth, but because he had been chosen as the one to hear it first. Why had the man walked into his church and not another? Why had he trusted him with the weight of such a dark secret? The pastor began to fear it wasn't a coincidence. Perhaps the confession was not a surrender but a performance, meant to taint the very place where people came for peace. St. Mark's had become a stage, and he, unwillingly, its witness. The town, too, began to fracture under the revelations. Friends eyed each other with suspicion, wondering how long a predator had lived among them unnoticed. Parents held their children tighter. Storefront conversations turned into accusations. Every unsolved disappearance was pulled back into the spotlight, and every unanswered question demanded a new explanation. The midnight confession had not only exposed one crime, it had reopened old wounds that many believed were long healed. Detective Simmons pressed forward, convinced there was more hidden beyond the surface. Each discovery painted the man not as someone driven by impulse, but as someone who calculated, controlled, and planned. He didn't stumble into his crimes, he orchestrated them. The confession, she realized, might not have been a crack in his armor of secrecy. It might have been part of the design. For every truth he revealed, she feared there were still lies buried beneath. The midnight words in the church had been precise, but precision could also mean manipulation. And as the evidence piled up, Simmons began to understand that this case was not about one victim, or even two. It was about a mind that had thrived in darkness for far longer than anyone dared to admit. Just as Detective Simmons felt she was finally gaining control of the case, everything unraveled. The man who had confessed so vividly inside the church was gone. One morning, officers assigned to monitor him found his apartment empty, his few belongings abandoned, and his neighbors reporting that he had left in the middle of the night with a single suitcase. Surveillance cameras later confirmed the truth. He had boarded a bus heading out of town under a false identity, disappearing into the currents of anonymity. For Simmons, the revelation was not just a setback. It was a devastating confirmation of her worst suspicion. The confession had never been an act of guilt. It had been a carefully crafted diversion. The town erupted in panic once the news spread. People who had once whispered outside St. Mark's now shouted openly, furious that a killer had confessed, only to slip through the cracks of the justice system. Parents refused to let their children walk home from school. Shop owners installed new locks and security cameras. Every shadow in the street felt threatening. St. Mark and S. Church became the center of heated debates. Some argued it had saved the town by exposing the truth, while others saw it as cursed, a place where evil had walked freely and left behind chaos. Reverend Jameson, who had once been respected and admired, now faced questions he could not answer. He spent sleepless nights staring at the altar, wondering whether the sanctuary had been chosen not for faith, but for spectacle. Detective Simmons followed the trail relentlessly. The man had covered his tracks well, but every false identity left faint traces. A bus ticket purchased with cash, a motel registration under a name that didn't exist, a fleeting appearance on a security camera in a nearby city. Each time she closed in, he seemed to slip further away, as if he were taunting her, forcing her to chase a ghost. The evidence from his apartment pointed to other potential victims, and Simmons could not shake the possibility that his disappearance meant new crimes were being planned. The clock was ticking, and every hour of his freedom weighed on her conscience. Meanwhile, the media swarmed the town, turning the story into a spectacle. Reporters camped outside the church, thrusting microphones into the faces of parishioners. News anchors spoke of the midnight confessor as though he were a legend, a villain crafted for television. Every broadcast only deepened the community's fear. People began to avoid the church altogether, its once warm glow now seen as a reminder of horror. Reverend Jameson's sermons grew emptier, his congregation dwindling until he was left preaching to only a few loyal souls who still believed the sanctuary could survive its stain. But Simmons refused to let the case become another tragic headline. She pushed further, uncovering that the man had ties to other states, other towns with similar unsolved disappearances. The more she dug, the clearer it became that the midnight confession was only the tip of something far larger. It wasn't just about Daniel Pierce. It wasn't just about one town. This was a man who thrived in movement, leaving destruction in his wake. And the church had merely been the moment he chose to expose a sliver of his truth. Simmons understood now that she was not just hunting a fugitive. She was unraveling the legacy of a predator who had turned confession into a weapon. Months passed before the break finally came. In a quiet town several states away, a motel clerk grew suspicious of a man who kept to himself, paying in cash and avoiding eye contact. The clerk had seen his face before, on the news reports about the midnight confessor. One phone call later, local police surrounded the building and the man was taken into custody without resistance. He did not fight, did not argue, and did not speak a word. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, as though capture was not the end of his story, but the next chapter he had prepared. News traveled fast, and within hours the story gripped the nation. The man who had once whispered his crimes in a midnight church was finally sitting in a cell. Detective Simmons flew out immediately to oversee the transfer back home. She wanted to see him face to face, to look into the eyes of the man who had taunted her through silence and movement. When she met him, he appeared calm, almost indifferent, as though the weight of justice meant little to him. His demeanor unsettled her. A guilty man should have looked broken, but this man looked satisfied, like someone who had orchestrated every step of the journey. Even in chains, he seemed in control. It confirmed Simmons's lingering fear. The confession had never been about redemption. It had been about power, choosing when and how to reveal the truth, controlling the narrative, bending others to his design. The trial became a spectacle unlike anything the town had ever witnessed. Courtrooms filled with reporters, every seat packed, every word transcribed for the evening news. Prosecutors presented the evidence, the hidden photographs, the belongings of victims, and the detailed confession that Reverend Jameson had heard within the church. Witnesses described his erratic behavior, his cold detachment, and the eerie way he studied those around him. Piece by piece, the case revealed not only Daniel Pierce's murder, but connections to other disappearances across state lines. Each revelation shocked the community further, painting a portrait of a man who had lived in plain sight while committing unspeakable crimes. For Reverend Jameson, the trial was both a relief and a torment. He testified about the night of the confession, recounting every chilling detail in front of a courtroom that hung on his every word. Though his account helped secure the conviction, it also carved deeper scars into his soul. The sanctuary he had once cherished would forever be remembered as the place where evil spoke its truth. Yet as painful as it was, he understood the importance of standing as a witness. Silence would have only allowed the darkness to spread. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, the town exhaled for the first time in months. Families of the victims wept, and Detective Simmons allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, though she knew closure could never fully heal the wounds. The midnight confessor was sentenced to life without parole, destined to spend his remaining years in a concrete cell. In the weeks that followed, St. Mark's Church slowly began to reclaim its identity. Parishioners returned, lighting candles and filling the pews with prayer. Reverend Jameson would often walk the aisle at dusk, the memory of that midnight still heavy in his chest, but now softened by the knowledge that truth had prevailed. The confession had shattered the town, but it had also exposed the darkness that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. The church, once haunted, stood again as a symbol of light, not because it was untouched by evil, but because it had faced it, endured it, and survived.